Good evening. It's October 24th, 2014. My name is Matthew Ogden, and I would like to welcome you to our weekly webcast here at LaRouchepack.com. Tonight, I'm joined here in the studio by Jason Ross and Megan Beets from the LaRouchePack scientific team, as well as Jeffrey Steinberg from Executive Intelligence Review. The four of us have been in extended discussion with Mr. LaRouche over the last 24 hours. So what you hear tonight will reflect directly Mr. LaRouche's outlook on the current world situation. Now, I'd like to start this evening's broadcast by inviting Jason Ross to come to the podium to deliver a report back on the extraordinary international conference that just occurred this past weekend, October 18th and 19th in Frankfurt, Germany, on the occasion of the 30th anniversary of the Schiller Institute, at which Jason was one of the panelists. The full proceedings of this conference are being made available on the Schiller Institute website, which is newparadigm.schillerinstitute.com. And I strongly encourage all of our viewers to study those proceedings in full. Before I introduce Jason, I would like to read the text of the resolution that was adopted at the conclusion of this conference by acclamation by all of the participants in the conference. And I think it reflects very clearly the spirit of this very important conference. It's titled, "Mankind is the Only Creative Species. Declaration of the Conference of the Schiller Institute, October 19th, 2014. It reads as follows. Mankind experiences presently a deep civilizational crisis where the foundations of society in many parts of the world have eroded and established codes of international relations have broken down. On top of this, we are faced with mortal dangers, each of which could lead to the potential extinction of the human species. There is first the Ebola pandemic, which is already totally out of control in Africa, for which there is no cure, and which is threatening to become more threatening than the Black Death of the 14th century. There is second the terrorist threat for the whole world, and genocide spreading from the so-called Islamic State Caliphate, not only demonstrating a subhuman barbarism, but explicitly threatening Russia and China, and therefore becoming the potential trigger to blow up all of Southwest Asia, and even leading to a new world war. And there is third, the absolute certainty that the completely bankrupt transatlantic financial system is about to blow up, threatening also to throw much of the world into a dark age. In light of these three mortal dangers, it is a question of life and death of humanity to stop the immoral and imbecilic policies of geopolitics and confrontation against Russia and China. Instead, we have to shift the agenda to the common aims of mankind and work together with Russia, China, India, and other nations to defeat these mortal threats. We call on all forces of reason in Europe and in the United States to join the emerging new economic order of the BRICS and the New Silk Road. Let's work to establish an inclusive peace order with the participation of every nation on the planet, a peace order for the 21st century, worthy of mankind as the only known creative species in the universe. Let us grow up into the adult age of humanity, where love, creativity, and beauty define the values of our common human family. As I said, this is available on the Schiller Institute website along with the proceedings of this conference in full. So I would like to ask Jason to come up and report on this conference. Jason, welcome back.
Thanks. So yeah, this conference was really very exciting, and it was a dramatic step upward, I think, even beyond the very good conference that was held in Germany a year and a half ago. There were over 350 people who attended. As a matter of fact, we had to remove the tables from the room and reconfigure it because it was standing room only as the conference opened. And this had people from all over the world, Europe, Asia, Australia, Africa, even a few people from the Americas were there too. The counterposition between the great crises confronting the world and the peace and development that are possible, between ISIS, Ebola, and the economic collapse, contrasted with the inspiring developments from the orientation of the BRICS countries, set up a healthy tension throughout the whole conference. After a musical introduction, Helga Zepp-LaRouche opened the proceedings with a greeting from her husband, Mr. Lyndon Larouche, and with a very powerful and pedagogical presentation on these triple threats that were in the resolution that Matt just read also. The threats of the Islamic State, of Ebola, and of the financial collapse, which everybody around the world knows is on its way. In every case, Mrs. Zepp-LaRouche gave the background on the problem, going beyond what people typically associated with it, and laid out the solutions. Often those solutions were ones that had been presented by LaRouche and the Schiller Institute for decades. So by drawing upon the highest cultural levels around the world, she said, we can have a true productive world dialogue on elevating mankind. And she concluded with the really beautiful success of China's Chang'e 3 mission and the release of the U-2 rover onto the moon. The next speaker was a professor whose name resembles Shi Zi, my apologies, professor, from the China Institute of International Studies, who spoke about how the one road, one belt concept of the new Silk Road, how that should be applied to international affairs. And he brought this up in several main subject areas. On innovation, he spoke about the transition in China from the bringing in technology that they initially had adopted to the going out policy that they are now moving towards and developing their own novel advancements. Advancements, he said, must be applied in an even manner and without striving for hegemony or for spheres of influence or for interference in the sovereignty of other nations. Development should strengthen the equality of a multipolar world. He talked about how development models have to take into account the cultures and the on-the-ground conditions in the various countries. And from the context of a future plan of development, the right decisions can be reached about how to make structural and other reforms, which always must come from a policy of non-interference in the sovereign rights of other nations. There are presentations on the role of specific countries in all of this, on the role of Iran, both historically in the old Silk Road and the potential for Iran as part of the new Silk Road. Iran, which has 15 neighbors, has a lot of diplomatic and transportation work to do. There was a very powerful presentation by Jayshree Sengupta. She's a senior fellow at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi, India, and she gave a very powerful presentation on the development of the BRICS and on the attacks against the BRICS. So she said, starting from the creation of the concept of the BRICS, or the naming of the BRICS by a Goldman Sachs executive in 2002, it's changed and now it is a leading factor in determining world politics. She quoted Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who said, for the first time, the BRICS brings together a group of nations on the parameter of future potential, rather than existing prosperity or shared identities. The very idea of BRICS is thus forward-looking. And she said that such a group, the BRICS, would indeed be a cause for worry for countries that have dominated the present international order. The BRICS nations today represent a huge block of world population and economy. 46% of world population, 18% of world trade, 26% of world landmass. The BRICS seek a multipolar world, rather than dominance by the developed nations. She brought up the example that in 1991, India was forced to seek out IMF assistance and was subjected to conditionalities from the IMF that prevented India from making its own decisions. The reforms allowed some people in India to make very good profits, but 300 million Indians are living in dire poverty, as though there are today two Indias, as she put it. Modi represents a real transformation in India, a real change, a real difference in government. He is moving to clean up India and to have the new development bank initiative. So with the new development bank, she pointed out, this will have proper voting rights. So today, the BRICS nations, 46% of the world population, have only 11% of the voting rights in the IMF. And voting reform is continually promised, but it never happens. So with the new development bank, the BRICS nations will be able to make their own policy, be able to make their own decisions. She said that overall, the glue that holds the BRICS together is their huge growth potential for the future and their large reservoir of young people, in particular in India's case. That's how to create the future world. That's the potential for it. Another very powerful presentation came from Natalia Vitrenko. She spoke on the economic and strategic crises confronting Ukraine and put this in a broader context. She said that despite Ukraine's wonderful climate, its excellent, very nutritious to the plants soil, and because of its obedience to the IMF over 22 years, its adherence to the WTO for 8 years, and now having signed an association agreement with the EU, Ukraine's heading into the abyss. She gave startling figures on the collapse of GDP and on the currency of Ukraine, on the explosion of the debt, and, of course, on the neo-Nazi supporting government in Kiev. And she put it in this context. She asked, where are the European values? Where are the European values of defense of minorities, of democracy? Why are they not being applied in Ukraine? She said that the world is shifting overall, away from the transatlantic. She said that a new G7 is being created, not by that name, but that 7 other non-G7 nations will have gone beyond the G7 in terms of GDP in the very near future. And in this context, she said, you see the promotion of war with Russia via Ukraine. She said, we got a horribly ethnically intolerant government which engages in war rather than dialogue with the eastern states of Ukraine, and this is promoted by outsiders who call it democracy. Those are some of the first presentations. The event overall had begun with a musical introduction, and at the conclusion of the first day, we were treated to and challenged by a wonderful presentation of Beethoven's only opera, Fidelio. It was conducted by Sergei Strid of the Schiller Institute with a small orchestra, soloists, choruses from a very international group among all of these, the soloists, the orchestra, and the choruses. The story of Fidelio is the story of the rescue of the imprisoned Florestan, who had been jailed for speaking truth to power, by his heroic wife, Leonora, who dresses up as a man under the name Fidelio to get access to the prison. It's based on the true story of the imprisonment of Marquis de Lafayette and of his wife Adrienne's work to free him. Now, the power of this performance, being in the context of a serious conference on the future of mankind, rather than as an evening entertainment for the overdressed and people who paid too much for tickets, it was really very, very, very powerful. It was met with a tremendous sustained ovation. It's really difficult to try to describe music, so you can hear it for yourself on the website. We had other presentations that filled in more of the specifics on the economy, for example. So what would a new Silk Road, what would the BRICS orientation mean for other nations as well, such as European nations? Well, we heard from one German steel expert who gave a really very good presentation on how absolutely essential and irreplaceable steel is as a resource, and then showed us the graphs about how world steel production has doubled over the past decade because of China, even as it collapses elsewhere, and had other astonishing graphs of the increase in China's production and consumption of steel, of coke, of cement. We really got a sense of what growth would be like, and he contrasted it to charts that showed the decreasing fraction of income derived from manufacturing among the European nations and the USA, among others. We heard from a Greek member of parliament who spoke about the many opportunities that Greece would see from the new Silk Road orientation, including increases of shipping and logistics, which Greece is a real expert at, but also a whole new paradigm of operation, restructuring the debt, separation of commercial and investment banking, and internal development projects. We heard from an Italian professor about building bridges, both figuratively and literally. He took us back to Da Vinci's plans for bridging the Bosporus, and he presented a ring of bridges: Gibraltar, Bosporus, where there are now two, or I think a third, Suez, and the proposed Messina and the Sicily-Tunisia bridges in Italy, a connection in the middle of the Mediterranean from Italy into Tunisia. This would be a very ambitious and very large project. And he said such projects obviously make sense from a long-term perspective, and they require that Europe have that same long-term view that the BRICS nations are expressing, or that Egypt is expressing with its canal. He said these bridges can move equipment, and they also allow us to meet other people, which he said you may find to be yourself seen in another light. We learned also about 100-year-old plans now being revived to connect the Danube with the Aegean. And we heard from the Soong Ching Ling Foundation in Beijing, whose representatives spoke about their invitation to Helga Sepp-LaRouche to their conference in Lanzhou and her trip to Beijing there. They spoke of also the need to use beautiful music, such as the German classics, as a way of uniting people and developing understanding and progress among nations. A speaker from the Umoja Pan-African League contrasted the centuries of colonial rule in Africa and the institution of the IMF and the World Bank with the promises of the new development bank and the opportunity for sovereign decision-making and finally an end to colonialism on that continent. Robert Barwick of Australia's Citizens Electoral Council spoke about the two possible directions for Australia. The current one, that of being a Pacific sheriff for the British, operating increasingly on finance and promoting genocidal varieties of environmentalism, or the opportunity for it to be a Pacific partner of the BRICS, with a manufacturing base as it had half a century ago, along with water and other large-scale development programs to have a positive role in international relations. On the strategic front, the presentations did a good job of helping sketch out an alternative global standpoint. We hear much today about, from the press, etc., about the imperial outlook, about that way of looking at affairs. So it was a welcome antidote, very refreshing and healthy, to get a sense of what a sane analysis of international affairs and strategy would be from someone with an outlook towards the future. So we had a retired French colonel who spoke on the need for a new concept of common security interests in Eurasia. He stressed that the world is multipolar and that, quote, all governments whose power comes out of the ballot box are legitimate. He warned strongly against the current foolishness of attacking Assad and the need to assist the government of Syria against the barbarism of the Islamic State. All nations, he said, quoting de Gaulle, have a duty to peace, a necessity to progress, and an obligation to aid all nations that wish it. On the U.S. front, the imposition of fascism here in the United States and its general toleration was addressed by Ray McGovern, who is a nearly 3-decade veteran analyst with the CIA, who painted a sobering picture of the lack of sovereignty among the nations of Europe, and also the broader destruction of the basic concept of law, from the Magna Carta to the Treaty of Westphalia, which he said is effectively dead now, and the U.S. Constitution, as evidenced by videos he showed of brazen lying by Michael Hayden and James Clapper. He firmly admonished those who wanted to comment on the situation or take actions that were convenient to them, quoting Martin Luther on the obligation to act where the battle is. And he concluded with advice to associate with like-intentioned people, to hold each other accountable, to act on their beliefs. He particularly encouraged older members of the older attendees of the conference to put themselves out there personally, bodily. He gave the example of when he stood and turned his back on Hillary Clinton and was beaten up and taken out of the room, as garnering a fair amount of sympathy with his gray hairs. He urged people to put those gray hairs to good use. We heard from Jacques Cheminade, a 2-time certified candidate for the French presidency. He spoke on the advantage of the other as the needed guiding concept in international affairs. He referred back to the story of Fidelio, that showed that fate does not govern us when we act with courage. And he spoke of a renewed Westphalian commitment to sovereignty and to joint development. He peppered his speech with examples, such as the Tsar of Russia's emancipating a black slave, who then went on to become the grandfather of Pushkin. He said we must create peace by looking at ourselves from the standpoint of the future. So our last section here, I can briefly talk about some of the scientific aspects of the conference as well. We heard from a Chinese nuclear expert on that nation's nuclear power ambitions and its large-scale educational program for nuclear scientists. We heard about the scientific image of what Germany should look like in 50 years. How should it have developed? What role will Germany be playing in this world in 50 years? I spoke about Mr. LaRouche's view of economic platforms and on the importance of physical chemistry as a basis for understanding physical economics, using Prometheus as an image of our truest identity. We have to eliminate poverty. We have to eliminate oligarchy. And we have to eliminate uselessness. We can't simply replace these things with physical satiety. You have to have a purpose. The greatest obligation of society is to ensure that its people have access to an opportunity to identities that will outlive them by contributing in something that is immortal. The last presentation of the conference was a rather chilling presentation by Dr. Wolfgang Lilke of the Fusion Energy Foundation in Germany on the grave condition of the Ebola pandemic and the need to get ahead of this virus, and more generally, to develop a healthcare infrastructure overall. He had shocking charts of the doctors and hospital beds per capita in the most affected African nations compared to Germany, Italy, the United States. And it really supported LaRouche's warnings that the conditions were being set, LaRouche's warnings from over a decade ago, that mankind was unprepared for a new biological holocaust caused by a lack of new research and the basic healthcare infrastructure as a foundation to prevent the general spread of diseases. So the discussion period to wrap up the conference touched on the possibilities of fusion power, what must be done to confront Ebola, which harkened back to Helga Zepp-LaRouche's quoting of the Chinese on the need for an all-inclusive security infrastructure. You can't have security only in some places. I think Ebola certainly demonstrates the physical and biological security that's required to have an overall security framework. Also, there were some we dispensed with the hogwash of claims about global warming caused by people. And Jayshree Sengupta spoke about India's potential role in combating Ebola. She referenced India's very advanced and relatively inexpensive, although that's not the only reason to use it, healthcare networks, pharmaceutical networks, biological research capabilities. And she reminded everybody that India is already helping with its wonderful pharmaceutical sector to produce medicines to take care of AIDS and HIV, and is helping developing nations with these medicines already. And Helga closed the discussion with a summary of the conference and with the need to fall in love with the potential for humanity, she put it. She said, fall in love in as powerful a way as you fell in love the first time. Fall in love with humanity. The potential of mankind is so beautiful, and we have to act from that standpoint. The discussion afterwards was really wonderful. There was a great sense of international camaraderie and of being people. At one informal get-together in the evening, for example, a very international group sang songs, recited poems, discussed policy and culture late into the evening. The kind of culture that really has to be created. Now, just one more thing I want to add from a discussion that we had with LaRouche last evening about the difference between human and animal behavior and communication, which I think will be more said about in a little bit. But the essential point to make about it that I think was reflected in the conference itself was that this overall direction, development around an uplifted view of mankind, it existed as an overall social sense at the conference. It was beyond the individual presentations. It's developed a life of its own, which I think is the mark of a very fruitful dialogue and a fruitful conference. The quality of discussion wasn't passing around rote incantations of accepted formulas. It was an actual discussion of something real. People meant what they said. It was a human discussion in which creativity expressed itself. It was a human conference. So the world's absolutely falling apart, as in those three dimensions that Helga spoke about in her presentation and reflected in that resolution: the Islamic State, Ebola, the financial system. And this conference was of great importance in pulling together the institutions, the kind of thinking, and the quality of discussion required to construct a multipolar world based on development, on progress, and on the advantage of the other. Ask yourself, what does development look like? What does it look like in the different countries? And for those of you watching here in the United States, just imagine if the U.S. joined this process. Just imagine that. If the U.S. was a partner, instead of sending Kerry around to threaten nations not to join the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, if the war policy with Russia via Ukraine was ended, if the true support for the Islamic State was rooted out and eliminated, such as by getting those 28 pages, and if we were the nation again of the outlook of Franklin, Washington, Hamilton, John Quincy Adams, Lincoln, and Roosevelt, just imagine what a wonderful and joyful world we could have. There's no need to hang on to stupid economic policies that make us depressed and say that we can't do anything. Mankind is the beautiful species, and we should be acting that way. And I think that the conference, as you should all watch it in its entirety and really enjoy it and savor it, really expressed that both in the presentations and in the overall culture that was created in the process of the conference.
Thank you. Let me just emphasize that Helga LaRouche's message in the wake of this very significant conference was that nothing but a complete global paradigm shift will save us from a new dark age, which is now undeniable as we see the very fabric of civilization being torn apart with this triple threat: global war and terrorism, global pandemic disease, and a total financial meltdown. Now, in that context, I would like to ask Jeff to respond to our institutional question for this evening, which addresses the first element of this triple threat to civilization directly. The question reads as follows: Mr. LaRouche, how would you propose to bring peace to Syria? Do you see any prospect of creating a unity government that would be the basis for a coordinated campaign against the Islamic State? Can there be a Geneva III agreement to establish such a unity government, and how would you go about it? And Jeff, I understand that you did get a chance to discuss this question directly with Mr. LaRouche, so I'd like to ask you to relate his outlook on this matter.
We did have a chance yesterday evening to discuss this issue at some length. And I think as with the approach to dealing with the Ebola crisis, you have to start out with a correct diagnosis. You've got to tell the truth about what it is that stands behind this disaster in Syria, the events next door in Iraq, the rise of ISIS. And you've got to acknowledge the fact that this entire Syria crisis was really precipitated in August of 2011, when President Obama did something that no legitimate elected head of state, no statesman would ever dream of doing, which was that he just simply made a straightforward declaration demanding that Assad be removed from office, despite the fact that Assad had been legitimately elected as president of Syria. And it was that initiative, that signal, that came in the context of what Mr. LaRouche warned about at the time, second half of 2011, that the overthrow and violent murder of Gaddafi in Libya signaled the fact that the United States and Britain and France at that time were committed to the idea of a strategic confrontation, not with countries in the Middle East or North Africa, but a strategic confrontation with Russia and China. Again, that was back in October, November of 2011. That was before any developments began in Ukraine, before anything emerged that would have suggested that Russia was in the crosshairs of the Western NATO powers. So the first thing that you've got to acknowledge is that if you're going to save Syria, you're going to have to bring President Obama to justice for the many crimes against the U.S. Constitution and international law that he committed. Yes, there is a very real prospect that you could have a Geneva III agreement, that you could carry out a combination of efforts to defeat ISIS in Syria, Iraq, and in other places where it's already spreading. But you've got to start, number one, with the fact that none of this is going to happen in the real world so long as this president is allowed to stay in office in the United States. And that, therefore, means that the continuation of the Obama presidency itself is an existential threat to not just Syria, but to the world as a whole. Secondly, you've got to also face the reality that we are in the midst of a war that has been going on for more than 35 years. Go back to the late 1970s when part of the British strategy known as the Bernard Lewis plan for destabilizing the Soviet Union involved the promotion by British intelligence and by U.S. intelligence of Islamic fundamentalist networks that were basically outgrowths of the collaboration between the Saudi monarchy, the Wahhabi clergy in Saudi Arabia, and the Muslim Brotherhood. So in effect, everything that we've now identified as the terrorist enemy of mankind, the images of the ISIS beheading of Western hostages, all of that is an outgrowth of a 30 years war plus that was sponsored by the British, by various U.S. governments, and that also must be fully exposed. The starting point for getting to the bottom of that reality is to declassify the 28 pages from the original Joint Congressional Inquiry into the 9/11 attacks. Those pages not only will reveal the direct hand of the Saudi monarchy in the creation and promotion of the 9/11 attacks here in the United States, but it will also reveal complicity by U.S. institutions. So the release of those 28 pages is another vital step towards getting at the truth of what's going on. Now, the defeat of ISIS depends on broadening the alliance to wage war against this dark age menace to the survival of every nation on this planet. You cannot be exclusive. You cannot leave out Iran. You cannot leave out Russia. You cannot leave out China. And you certainly cannot leave out the government of Syria, which was legitimately elected and was re-elected by internationally certified elections just several months back. With that kind of combination, you're bringing together the nations that have a common interest, a strong vested interest in defeating this scourge of ISIS terrorism. Russia knows perfectly well that well over 1,000 leading commanders now fighting in Iraq and Syria for ISIS are Chechens who were involved in the fight against Russia going back to the Caucasus Wars that started in the mid-1990s. The Chinese know perfectly well that there are hundreds of Uyghur fighters who've been recruited to al-Qaeda and now ISIS from the Xinjiang region of northwest China. So the natural alliance is there to put together a coalition of forces that can crush and defeat ISIS. But it means that there's got to be a commitment from the outset right now to acknowledging and defending the sovereignty of the Syrian state. The idea that somehow or other we're fighting ISIS and at the same time continuing to pursue an assault against the Assad government in Syria is absolutely preposterous. There is a false notion that's been repeated by NATO, by the Obama administration, that somehow or other there is a, quote, legitimate secular opposition to Assad and that this is what can be supported. Well, that happens to be a complete fraud. Vice President Joe Biden briefly touched on some aspects of the truth of the situation when he frankly acknowledged in a speech up at Harvard a few weeks ago that big problem in defeating ISIS is that most of our so-called allies in the Middle East have been the biggest promoters and backers of ISIS since the beginning. And he named Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Kuwait, Qatar as countries that are in fact siding with ISIS against Syria and against the Kurds who are fighting desperately to survive in northern Syria right now. So start with the truth. Eliminate the root cause of the problem, which is the illegal, unconstitutional presidency of Barack Obama, and put in a government in the United States, a viable and effective presidency that can, with open arms, help organize a coalition to actually crush ISIS. This can be done in a matter of weeks or months, but not if the actual agenda of the U.S. administration is destabilize and lead to war with Russia, with China, and continue to cover up the alliance of the Anglo-Saudi apparatus that created this phenomenon in the first place.
Thank you, Jeff. Let me ask you a question now on the second element of this triple threat to civilization, which is the rapidly developing Ebola crisis, which is now threatening to become the Black Death of the 21st century, and which, if not confronted with an extraordinary international effort to stop the spread of the virus, could very well wipe out very large percentages of the human population on this planet. And as we've documented extensively during previous webcasts and elsewhere on this website, the outcome of this population reduction is precisely the stated intent of the leading spokesmen of the British Empire, most notably Bertrand Russell and Prince Philip, both of whom have called explicitly for the spread of deadly disease in order to kill off large numbers of the human species and reduce the world's population. Now, as viewers of the LaRouche PAC website know, over the past 2 weeks, we've featured multiple written statements and recorded interviews on this crisis with Deborah Freeman, who, in addition to being LaRouche's spokeswoman, is also a certified doctor of public health. We began last week's webcast with a short clip from a video interview by Deborah, who was also the featured guest last night on the weekly LaRouche PAC Activists Call, the audio of which is available on the LaRouche PAC website if you missed it. Now, Deborah has just published today a very detailed war plan spelling out precisely what kind of urgent international mobilization must take place if we are to contain and defeat the threat of a global Ebola pandemic. This document, which is titled An Emergency War Plan to Defeat Ebola, is now available in draft form and will be published on the LaRouche PAC website in the very near future. So, Jeff, I know you've been working very closely with Deborah Freeman and also Mr. LaRouche over the past 2 weeks on developing this program, which has been informed by extensive discussions with very qualified professionals in the fields of both medical science and public health. So I'd like to ask you to lay out for us the basic essentials of this plan in the context of the necessary paradigm shift that's needed in general.
I'll be brief because within a very short period of time, the war plan will be publicly available. And that came out of a series of meetings that Deborah Freeman and I had with Mr. LaRouche earlier this week and the previous week. And what's very clear is that the people in the field of public health emergency response, people who have been involved in planning for dealing with biological and chemical warfare catastrophes, who have a certain sense of how to conduct this mobilization. These people are profoundly frustrated by the fact that what has been done so far has been absolutely shameful and has been a complete failure to respond to a threat that in many respects is worse than the threat of the Black Death of the 14th century. What you would need to do if you were serious is to organize a single, unified, global effort. You'd want to create a steering committee. And Mr. LaRouche's recommendation is that the United States and Russia, having been two nations deeply involved in preparations for large-scale military and counter-military operations in the biological and chemical warfare field, with very extensive work and capability for a crash project to develop a vaccine against the Ebola, that the U.S. and Russia should work together to chair an international coordinated effort. And such an effort must begin immediately by vastly reducing the death rate at the hot zone epicenter of the Ebola outbreak, which is in the countries of West Africa, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Guinea, and now we have the first confirmed cases spreading into Mali. So you've got to, number one, contain the geographic spread of the disease, and that is something that requires immediate action, literally today, tomorrow. There are things that can and must be done. Many people who are in that West Africa area will naturally tend to migrate to other parts of Africa because the harvest season in West Africa has ended, and millions of people will tend to migrate to other parts of Africa. If carriers of Ebola get into major population centers like Kinshasa or Lagos, then the fight is to a very large extent already lost. So there are emergency measures that must be taken right now. The United States, Russia, China, other major countries have an extensive airlift capability. We've got to bring in massive amounts of vital medical equipment. We've got to have equipment ready to provide intravenous liquids to people. We've got to basically reduce the death rate. That means also bringing qualified medical personnel in from all over the world to deal with the crisis. We have to airlift in massive amounts of food, because right now the crisis in West Africa is compounded by the fact that there are threats of mass starvation in some of the very areas where the disease is at its most intense. Under this umbrella of an international coordinated steering committee operation, you must have a crash effort, literally a Manhattan Project, an international Manhattan Project to develop a vaccine immediately for Ebola. And that means that you've got to stick with the appropriate international standards so that you actually produce a viable vaccine, but you've got to do it very quickly under the highest standards and immediately prepare for mass production of the proven and tested vaccines once that's happened. This can be accomplished in a matter of months, and it must be done. In the meantime, you've got to establish in other areas outside of West Africa, countries and regions that may be particularly susceptible to the spreading of Ebola. The Caribbean region, countries like Haiti and the Dominican Republic, are highly vulnerable. You've got to prepare in advance systems for early detection, and you've got to establish Hill-Burton standard levels of available hospital care. That doesn't mean that every hospital, every outpatient clinic has to be able to immediately handle this kind of treatment. It means that early detection and systems by which certain critical hospitals are identified in each local geographic area to deal with the crisis. You should also be doing a mass inoculation, mass vaccination campaign against the influenza, Because, for example, here in the United States, we're at the beginning of the flu season, and many of the early symptoms of influenza are very similar to the early onset symptoms of Ebola. So you've got to inoculate your entire population so that you minimize the impact of the flu. Otherwise, you're facing an overload of the hospital system. But again, the epicenter is in West Africa. That's where the greatest concentration of effort is required. The U.S., Russia, a number of other countries have hospital ships and other naval vessels that are easily transformed into hospital ships. And because the three countries that are the epicenter of this crisis are all on the west coast of Africa, you could bring a fleet of hospital ships with tens of thousands of beds among them, which by their nature as ships are quarantine areas, and you could begin to take the kinds of emergency measures that are required. Now, the problem again comes down to the fact that you need leadership. And President Obama, in this crisis as well as the crisis around ISIS, has demonstrated that he has no interest and no intention of providing leadership. The U.S. so far, since the outbreak, has spent a grand total of $300 million. And parenthetically, as of next Tuesday, $4 billion will have been spent on the midterm elections in the United States. Secondly, President Obama virtually threw in the towel last week when he had the audacity to name Ron Klain as his so-called Ebola czar. Anybody doing an even basic internet search will find that Ron Klain was formerly the chief of staff to America's leading genocidalist Al Gore, and Klain is on the record in numerous interviews saying that, in his view, the #1 problem facing humanity is overpopulation. So he's right out of the Bertrand Russell, Prince Philip camp that says population reduction is a desirable goal. And remember that Bertrand Russell made the point in 1949 that the best way to control population is to develop a means of generating a Black Death once every generation. So we need none of that. We need a concerted effort among genuine sovereign nations that are committed to the betterment and survival of mankind, because that's what's on the line right now.
Now, the third element of this triple crisis is the imminent threat of a total meltdown of the transatlantic financial system. Mr. LaRouche has been forecasting precisely this type of breakdown crisis since we abandoned Franklin Roosevelt's Bretton Woods system and adopted the purely speculative casino system instead, based on fictitious money as opposed to truly productive wealth. This is obviously only accelerated since the repeal of Glass-Steagall in 1999 and has reached the point now where it can no longer sustain itself and is set to implode at any minute. Now, it should be remembered that it was precisely this type of breakdown crisis in the 14th century, with a chain reaction collapse of the three biggest banking houses in Europe in 1343 to 1344, which set the stage for, first, a great famine in 1347, which was then followed by the Black Plague, which ultimately wiped out an estimated third of the entire population of Europe. Now, all of this occurred simultaneously with the ravaging of the entire continent by irrational religious warfare. So when you look at the combination of these factors, pandemic disease, religious warfare, and a total financial collapse, you see that civilization today is facing a new dark age, in fact, and worse than that of the 14th century, in which, as Helga LaRouche emphasized, the entire fabric of civilization is being torn apart, and that only a total paradigm shift, on par with the Golden Renaissance, can cause the necessary transformation to save civilization, as we've been emphasizing during this broadcast tonight. So, Jeff, briefly, can you give us a picture of this third threat to civilization, the financial and economic breakdown crisis, and what must be done to prevent it?
A quick footnote on what Matt just discussed about the 14th century. the trigger of the bankruptcy of those three banks was the fact that Europe had gone through a generation of permanent warfare, and virtually all of the debt that led to the bankruptcy of those banks was war debt that had been accumulated. Now, we're at a very delicate moment as we speak today. On Sunday, the European Central Bank is scheduled to release the outcome of the so-called stress tests on the largest European banks in order to try to cheat on the final exams before the report cards were issued. The ECB in the last few weeks has been issuing their own quantitative easing, buying up various damaged assets from the books of the European banks. But any honest rendering of that stress test will show that virtually all of the too-big-to-fail banks throughout Europe are hopelessly bankrupt, beyond repair, and that's similarly the situation with the big half-dozen banks here in the United States. Since the 2008 crisis, nothing has been done to actually alleviate the disaster. And in fact, the major banks in the United States today are 40% larger than they were, and global derivatives, purely speculative side bets among leading financial institutions, banks and non-banks, hedge funds, all of them, now come in the range of $1.7 to $1.9 quadrillion. So you have a mountain of debt that can never and will never be paid. And it's that mountain of debt that is leading to the austerity policies that are killing off nations around the world, now increasingly in the advanced sector. The answer to this is very, very clear. That entire financial bubble has to simply be wiped out, written off. There are 4 bills in the U.S. Congress right now to reinstate Glass-Steagall. That should be done immediately. Reestablish an absolute wall of separation between commercial banks and all of this casino gambling activity. The moment that you do that, that gambling debt, without the promise of taxpayers' bailout, will be wiped out. We'll have, at that point, an opportunity to go back to a credit system, as was established by our founders here in the United States, and we can work our way out of this crisis in the same way that there are clear measures that can be taken to destroy and defeat ISIS and to also defeat the plague of Ebola. The question is, will people begin to behave like true human beings? Human beings are creative. Human beings think about the future. They can change. They can make corrections over mistakes. And that means repudiating all of those common sense ideas. Well, impeachment's impossible, or, how can you change the banks? How can you write off the debt? What about my little pension or this or that? All of these things right now are mental blocks to people behaving like true human beings. And I can tell you that because we're facing 3 simultaneous existential threats to mankind as a whole, it really poses a test whether or not human beings will be truly human and will adopt the necessary changes in policy. What Helga talked about in last weekend's conference as a completely new paradigm in thinking, because right now that represents the difference between extinction and survival for mankind.
And let me just follow up directly off of what you just ended with, Jeff, in order to pose the final question to Megan Beets. As Helga emphasized in her speech last weekend, upon having just returned back from a very high-level trip that she had made to China, she said, in China, you see the expression of the new paradigm with what China is doing along with the other nations of the BRICS, with the tremendous cultural optimism that's being harnessed by Xi Jinping with both the new Silk Road policy, but also the aggressive lunar exploration and development program, which China is now carrying out. She said, "This represents an entirely new conception of man, in which mankind's identity is defined from the standpoint of the future and its relationship to the cosmic order. This is a new system superseding national interest as the basis for collaboration among nations for the common interest of mankind." So Helga ended her speech with a very inspiring video compilation of footage from the China Chang'e 3 mission, the U-2 rover mission. And we just learned yesterday that the next stage of this mission has now been successfully launched, the Chang'e 4, or what's actually being called the Chang'e 5T for test. And this is a mission which will complete a circumlunar flight around the moon, will come back to Earth in 8 days, and will re-enter Earth's atmosphere. This is the major challenge of this mission, to make sure the craft will be slowed down sufficiently coming through the atmosphere to be able to make a landing again back on Earth. And by combining the ability to return a craft from the moon with this mission, with the previous success of the Chang'e 3 mission of landing the rover on the lunar surface, China will then have proven its capability for a planned future mission, the Chang'e 5, to land a craft on the moon, mine a sample from the lunar soil, take off again from the moon's surface, and return that sample safely to Earth. So, Megan, I wanted to ask you how we can see this great optimism coming from China with their space program in the context of what Helga identified as this total paradigm shift necessary to save us from this triple crisis that we now face. What should this tell us about the true identity of mankind as a species and a new conception that man must have of himself?
Well, let me just begin with a comment that was made by a U.S. expert, Joan Johnson-Fries, who's a professor at the U.S. Naval War College, commenting on China's successful launch of the Chang'e 5T. She said, "Its significance is not only in the demonstration of technical abilities, but in a continued political will to achieve its space goals over long periods of time. That is what China has that the U.S. currently lacks." So I thought that summed up the situation we're in quite well. Now, Matt, as you said, the current mission, the Chang'e 5T, or T1, this test mission, was upgraded from Chang'e 4 as an acceleration of China's space program. It's the final step before the Chang'e 5 mission, expected to be launched in 2017 to return a sample of lunar soil to Earth. Now, after the Chang'e 5 is currently the last planned Chang'e mission, after which the unofficial plan is to then move to begin sending manned missions to the surface of the moon, which is slated to begin sometime in the early 2020s and is something which mankind has not done for 40 years. Now, what I want to do is just quickly give a sketch of the pace of China's manned spaceflight program, just to give people a sense of the kind of really rate of achievement coming from China. The current program for human spaceflight, the Shenzhou program, began in 1992-1993, which was just over 20 years ago. Already by 2003, the Shenzhou 5 mission put China's first man into space, and China became the third country to independently put a man into space. 5 years after that, in 2008, the Shenzhou 7 mission gave us China's first spacewalk, and I would encourage people to watch the videos of this. It was broadcast back to the entire nation. There's complete optimism. The Shenzhou 9 mission in 2012 rendezvoused with China's first space station, space lab, the Tiangong-1, which I'll say something more about in a moment. In 2013, last year, the Shenzhou 10, which is the most recent manned spaceflight mission, gave us China's longest spaceflight of 15 days. They performed a rendezvous with Tiangong-1. The astronauts entered the space station, performed scientific experiments which were broadcast back to school classrooms on Earth all over China. Now, the Tiangong, let me just say something for a minute about this. China has plans for putting a fully operational multi-module space lab and space station into orbit in the early 2020s, Tiangong 3, which will be equipped for long-term habitation of astronauts. Now, all of this is being done with a clear eye toward the moon as a base of operations as man expands farther out into space with an eye toward sending crafts out toward Mars. The moon is being eyed as a base of development for resources that will be utilized in the exploration of space and also in the further development of man on Earth, particularly with the fusion fuel of helium-3. So with China, we have not only a commitment, but an actualization of a commitment of moving mankind into a new era, with the recognition that they're not doing this for China, but this is being done for the progress of all mankind. Now, Mr. LaRouche emphasized that what China is doing is unique. What China is doing is the most advanced of any nation on the planet. But not only is its importance in that, the importance of what China is committed to is that this is truly human. And I think that just really puts before us the task that we face. Mankind is faced with having been dominated by an animal system of the British Empire for decades, much longer. And the task we face before us today is to not be stuck in an animal system, not cling to animal ways of life. Now, this flies in the face of popular opinion, and this is particularly the problem that we face here in the United States and in the transatlantic, that most people don't know the difference between man and between animal life and what is truly human. We're dealing with a culture where most people think of themselves as living lives in animal terms. Now, they may not realize that this is what they're doing, but most people, even very good, well-meaning people, go through life in such a way that their day-to-day experience is shared in quality with the lives of higher animal life. Now, you're dealing with a culture where most people's day-to-day experiences are filling time with things and activities which conform to certain standards of society, certain standards of popular opinion, measurements of the meaning of life based on habits, traditions. Most people never reach beyond their mortal flesh, never reach into the domain which is truly human and true human life. So what do we mean here by human life? We'll take an example. In first approximation, we can take something which is a shadow of human life, which is a human economy. And if we can put the first graphic up on the screen here, take a human physical economy. So what you see on your screen is a reflection of the process of a human economy stretching from the 1700s up until today in the United States. So as you look at this chart, which is the power per capita in the United States, meaning we take the entire power throughput of the economy, we divide it by the current population, and we get how much power measured in watts is behind each individual in your economy. So you'll notice two things. One, you'll notice that over time, the power throughput of the economy is rising at an accelerating rate, even as the population rises. The second thing you'll notice is that the source of the power is changing over time, and this is what you see by the changing colors in the graph. The green color to the left, meaning that at a certain point all and then most of the power supplied to the economy was coming from wood, then moving on to coal, then moving on to mostly petrochemicals and natural gas, and then moving on, although never quite realized, to the red sliver at the top of the chart there is the potential of nuclear power, the harnessing of the power of the atomic nucleus. So now each of these power sources represents a platform for mankind. in each of these modes of operation, which is reflected or indicated by the different power sources, it's not just that man has more power, man has different powers. Man is able to access different potentialities in matter and energy, such as the powers of chemistry. We're able to understand more and more what can keep people alive for longer. We're able to harness powers which lead to faster and faster forms of transportation, more energy-dense forms of metals production, and so on and so forth. Now, each of these platforms, which is represented by these power sources, none of them could have been produced by animal life. You know, an animal would never produce a steam engine, and an animal could never harness and put to use the power of the nucleus. These are uniquely human modes of operation. And yet, while no animal could have produced those platforms, there's nothing in man's activity of operating within any one of these particular platforms which distinguishes him as truly human. So again, while there's going to be no monkey nuclear economy, there's nothing about man being able to occupy and operate day-to-day life and carry out activities utilizing this the particular technologies of a nuclear economy. It's not that distinguishes him as human. It's no particular state, no matter how advanced, which distinguishes man from animal, but rather it's in man's ability to occupy what lies in between, to occupy the change of platform to platform, which is the experience of creative discovery, which occurs uniquely within the individual human mind. The bringing into being for mankind knowledge of a new principle, which corresponds to a power in and over the physical universe. Now, just to look very briefly, more specifically at that, take the often cited case of Johannes Kepler, who discovered the solar system. And he discovered the solar system not by description, not by experience and observation. And in fact, first, Kepler had to prove the utter impossibility of measurement and of mathematics of the system of ever solving the problem of what the solar system was. Kepler had to put the observations and the measurements away and enter the domain of the human imagination. And he had to carefully feel out the geometry of the human mind. And he had to generate a conception of the mind which was invisible to number. It was invisible to the measurements of the current system, which corresponded to a valid discovery of a true principle. This act of human creativity by Kepler, this is an action to which the universe responds. Kepler was able to find the true meaning of the solar system as an object of the human mind. He was able to find what the mind could make of the solar system. And it's that discovery which has allowed the United States, China, and human beings to begin to venture out into the solar system physically and develop it as a power within man's hands. Now, that same type of experience of the delving into the creative imagination to discover the characteristics of the universe as a whole, this is the same type of experience that we get in the performance of classical music. This is the same type of experience that we get in the passion of a poetic idea, the passion of discovery. Now, it's this ability for the mind to reach and to grow to encompass that which it has never experienced before, and to absorb and make more and more of the solar system an object of the human mental life, as Kepler did, as Beethoven, as Mozart did and continue to do today. This is unique human life. These are human experiences. This is what mankind must more and more strive to give himself access to. And that's our challenge today. This is the challenge that we face in our culture, in fighting with our fellow citizens to cease tolerating the kind of animal system which guides their day-to-day life and realize that we have a higher calling. This is the mission that we face with the development of the moon, to absorb the moon into the domain of human life, realize and discover its unique human-based identity. And that is implicitly what the meaning of China's commitment to its space mission is, in leading the way not just for China, but for all of mankind. And I think that we should really join them in taking up that mission and fight to change the United States before it's too late.
Thank you very much, Megan. I want to thank Jason for joining us tonight, and I especially want to thank Jeff for being with us here in the studio. I'm going to bring a conclusion to tonight's webcast on that note, and I want to thank you for joining us. So stay tuned to LaRouchePack.com, and good night.